Good morning, everybody. By the time July 17 rolled around in 1945, the war in Europe was finished. It was still going on in the Pacific. And Harry Truman, who had replaced Franklin Roosevelt, and Clement Attlee, who had replaced Winston Churchill, met with Joe Stalin in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, to talk about the future of Western Europe. In February of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt traveled to the Crimea on the Black Sea to meet with Churchill and Stalin. So our event is a few months after that. The war in the Pacific was very ferocious in early 1945. Here's Iwo Jima and the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. But in Europe, it seemed to be getting closer to an end. In March of 1945, we crossed the Remagen Bridge on the Rhine River, so the American army is into Germany. But the next month, in April, Franklin Roosevelt died. So for many Americans, he was the only president they'd ever known. And when Harry Truman became president, here's a picture of Truman taking the oath, no one really quite knew what kind of president he was going to be. He was actually quite unknown to a lot of Americans, even though he was the vice president. In April, we met the Russian army at Torgau on the Elbe River, southwest of Berlin. So the two Allied armies are meeting in Germany. And on May 7, the German army surrendered. And Dwight Eisenhower took the surrender. So the next day, May 8, was declared Victory in Europe Day by President Truman. So lots of rejoicing in the United States, but we didn't forget that we were still fighting the Japanese, and that was very, very intense. For instance, on May 11, one of our aircraft carriers, the Bunker Hill, was hit by a kamikaze attack. So all eyes are now on the Pacific, or most eyes, I guess. So in June, the great powers decided to divide up Germany into 4 zones: British, American, French, and Russian. And then Berlin itself was divided into 4 zones, and it was within the Russian zone, so that's going to lead to tension later. July 16 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, was the first successful explosion of a nuclear device, and this is the day before our event. So when Truman went to Potsdam, he knew this, but then so did Joe Stalin, because the Russians had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. So Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin. So if you look to the lower left, you can see Potsdam, and the place of the conference was here. This was a Prussian building from the early 1900s. Irony, of course, because the Prussian military is associated with the German army. And initially, Churchill was at the meeting, Truman in the middle, Stalin on the right, but then Churchill had to leave midway through the conference because of political changes back in England. And then Clement Attlee took his place, and I mentioned Attlee in my introduction. So here's Attlee. This is a reminder that political situations are really in flux as the war comes to an end, all over the place. And one of the things the Potsdam Conference did was declare on July 26 that if Japan didn't surrender, it was going to be destroyed. So we were getting ready to invade Japan. But then on August 9, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and then a few days later, another one on Nagasaki. And a few days after that, Japan quit the war, and then on September 2 was the official surrender, and here's the photograph of the surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. So the war's over. So what next? Well, back home, rationing is ended. It took some weeks to dismantle the whole procedure that was set up for rationing. So that was good for the American people, but what about the 15 million men and women who are in uniform? Many of these returned. Now what are they going to do for work and where to live and so on and so forth? And then in Asia and Europe, here's a picture of Dresden in Germany, all this destruction, displacement of people. How do you rebuild? So lots of questions. in 1945.